Good morning to everyone on the West Coast, afternoon in the East, and good evening for those of you connecting in from elsewhere. As Shirley introduced, it is Data Protection Day, well, Data Privacy Day here in America, Data Protection Day for those of you in the European Union. I always think it's somewhat amusing in that data privacy and protection gets a single day, whereas cybersecurity manages to get the entire month of October. However, I would say that one thing to consider is that while data security is traditionally given a much more high profile, larger budgets, and a great deal more attention, I think that it's important to recognize that one of the main purposes of security is protecting privacy. So in today, I hope to bring some more of you over to this idea, and we're going to talk about why you should care as data security professionals, why you should care about privacy, sort of what does privacy really have to do with data security and why does it matter, and to convince you that this isn't just a problem for the lawyers and compliance officers. So with that, I'd like to get started talking a little bit about what is privacy? What does it matter? There have been many definitions of privacy, and this is borrowed a little bit from some formal writings on it. I think it's been repeated on Wikipedia and numerous places. But privacy is the individual or a group to seclude themselves or information about themselves and express themselves selectively. And he goes on, it belongs to natural persons, meaning it's not something that belongs to companies or corporations. Privacy it varies by country to cultural group. And it's also tied up in the idea of bodily integrity. That's great, Greg. You managed to give me a Wikipedia definition. What does it really mean, though? Well, to me, privacy is what gives individuals freedom. Privacy is what allows us to have the ability to make decisions for ourselves, to understand how decisions are made about us, and to safeguard basically ourselves from the tyranny of the machine, the tyranny of a dictatorship or a country. It is what gives individuals controls to steer their life and to give them control over that. 2018 was a big wake-up call for a lot of people, and whether it's had as much of an impact on their behavior, I think is still to be seen. But there were a tremendous number of scandals and news articles talking about everything from potential interference in a U.S. election to Cambridge Analytica, as well as any number of sophisticated attacks against companies and the loss of data. It was also the year which brought us the effective date and enforcements commencing under GDPR, which I will talk about shortly. That's the general potato. I can't imagine anyone isn't familiar with it yet, so I'm not going to spell it out. But what else is privacy? Well, it is the ability to control that data. And the decisions that get made about individuals, their lives, and how they live them. By 2020, we're going to have over 20, various predictors and naysayers say we'll have over 24 billion internet-connected devices. Most of those devices are going to be collecting some form of individual information associated with individuals. The constant collection and use of data about people to glean information, make decisions about them, and target them is going to be a significant focus of today's presentation. One of the highlighted theme for this year's Data Privacy Day was data as an asset and the need for individual consumers to safeguard it and keep track of it, and that companies should test it. But why? Why is data such a big deal? Why is it so important? Why is our personal data of so much value? And that's because it's tremendously useful. You find it in everything from consumer and business records to website searches to the GPS data derived from your phone, your automobile, across a wide variety of usages, whether it's healthcare, banking, social media posts and actions, romance, if you're using various mobile apps for dating. Data is the lifeblood of modern economy. One of the other big buzzwords that we often hear is discussions about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and data is clearly the lifeblood of those technologies. As more and more data gets generated by a larger variety of sensors and interconnected devices, and the processing power and technology grows, there is more that can be done with it. And the only thing that really stands between the abuse of that data and the possibility of it realizing its full value is the concept of some form of data protection rights. A lot of people have become very dissatisfied. There's often discussion about, oh, it's too late, there is no privacy on the internet. However, I would say that I think instead of just giving up, we have to focus our efforts on doing business with companies that respect our data, doing business in a manner for our customers that respects them as well, that respects our employees, and really paying attention. As a data security professional, the value of that data is tremendous to you in conducting your business. However, it is also what you should be focusing on protecting. Right now, as mentioned, the tremendous growth in the amount of data being collected, but even very small amounts of data turn out to be tremendously useful in disclosing information about individuals. The chart that you're looking at right now was created by LaTanya Sweeney at Carnegie Mellon University as part of a white paper she wrote. It's now codified, and you can actually find it at dataprivacylab.org. And this was illustrating the fact that you could uniquely identify an individual in a fairly large percentage of cases with only having a 5-digit zip code, the date of birth, and the gender of that individual. Now, you're thinking, well, what does that matter? Well, what it matters is that you could have a medical data set that's anonymized or more likely pseudo-anonymized an individual so that it only has a portion of their information. But then from a publicly available voter registration list, it'd be possible to tie that data back and tie an actual name to another data set. So this fusing of different data sets, in order to create a profile, whether for a lawful purpose or a nefarious one, is something that I think all companies and all individuals need to keep in mind. Are you safeguarding that data in a manner that is going to make this more difficult for criminals or a potential abuse in the future, by a company that is maybe skating a little too thin on what is appropriate behavior and not putting its customers or society first. One problem with discussing data privacy and data protection is that it has a tremendous vocabulary that is often very specialized. I'm not going to take today to suggest that we're going to go through all of this vocabulary. This is all things that you'll find crop up throughout, but let's just focus very quickly on a few items. Along that left side, we have proprietary, confidential, classified, person identifiable, personal data, all of these types of data that we see discussed. One thing I think it's very important to remember is that data can be divided into two very broad. That which deals with humans and natural persons, from which privacy rights arise, from which these ideas that individual liberties arise, and then data which is really the purview of property of a corporation or an entity. Companies can have trade secrets. Companies can have proprietary or confidential or classified data, as may humans. But companies themselves, non-human entities don't have privacy rights. And so just constantly remembering when we're looking at privacy concerns, we're looking at the concerns and issues that belong to human beings. And so that we have to take into account that their personal, sensitive, and health information has to be treated with the respect that you would afford another human being. And that we aren't just dehumanizing them by referring to them as the data subject. Remembering that there's a real person on the other end of that, and that we need to be respectful of that, I think is a critical thing that as professionals in this industry, we need to take away. As I said, privacy and data protection has this tremendous vocabulary, and understanding it and how it fits into what you're doing in your role, whether it is in marketing or sales or providing engineering support for some technology, it's necessary to understand that vocabulary and its interaction of the data that you've collected in order to be a responsible steward and protector of that data and the privacy rights associated with it. So where do all of these privacy rights come from? I mean, in some cultures and countries, it's seen as an inherent right, and you'll find it in the constitution of those countries. Very often we'll hear in the United States a discussion of, oh, your constitutional rights to privacy. But honestly, that's been shoehorned in somewhat, from the Fourth Amendment and protection from unlawful search and seizure and trespass. And it primarily focuses on the body. We also look towards various privacy acts and the Federal Trade Commission Act in the United States, which very often focus very sectorally or only abstractly at individual rights of privacy. Very often the Federal Trade Commission is discussed as the primary enforcement body in the United States. However, it relies upon specifically Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, dealing with unfair competition or deceptive trade practices to hook into this idea that individuals, natural persons, have rights of privacy. And it is typically, it enforces its viewpoint on what is appropriate or inappropriate based upon, was it deceptive? Was there a lack of transparency? Was data collected or used in some manner that it was against what the consumer or data subject was told the information? Or is it just manifestly unfair that the data was collected and used for a purpose? In the United States, we have a tremendous breadth of sectoral privacy regulations, as opposed to many other countries in which we see more of an omnibus act, where it's more of a broader approach to privacy. However, even just considering the U.S., privacy regulations vary by geography. It is state by state, so that in California, we have the California Online Privacy Protection Act, but we are now counting down the days to the California Consumer Privacy Act, which will be discussed in a little bit later, as being very similar to the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. We've also seen recent laws come into the books, such as the Vermont Data Broker Law, which requires registration by data brokers and has specific requirements as to minimum standards of security to be implemented around data that is collected and processed by those businesses. However, as we take a look at this wide range of privacy acts, the one thing that becomes clear is all of them depend upon security. Without security, there can be no privacy. I think I've heard people also sort of say conversely, without privacy, why did you bother? Because if you have no rights to privacy, if you have no ability to safeguard yourself against the government or other intrusions from individuals, from companies, I think it's very important to realize that at the end of the day, security is important, but what it's protecting is also equally important. You're going to hear me discuss today the EU GDPR, and in no way is that to suggest that, oh, it has supremacy over all of these other acts, or that it's the best privacy regulation that's been implemented. What it is one that is very comprehensive, one that evolved from a previous European Union privacy directive, and one which is itself been refined over decades of thought, refined the privacy directive, which led to the GDPR, which spent over 4 years in draft form before finally taking effect in May last year. So you will hear me discuss it. It's not that I feel that that's the absolute high, not from the standpoint of like, oh, this is the higher watermark, and this is how it should be, despite the fact that we do see a number of countries just cut and paste it and use it as a form of privacy reg. I think it's important to recognize it's made valuable considerations, and I'm going to use it pretty much to teach us from an outline of what to look for in various privacy regulations. But with that, let's move on. Why do people care so much about the regulation and the GDPR? Well, I remember where I was on May 25th, 2018, because when I woke up, these were the two big headlines that you saw on the first day of GDPR. Facebook got hit with 8.8 billion in lawsuits on the first day, and the US websites went dark because they weren't confident. Numerous sites weren't confident in their ability to comply with the law, and they didn't want to get hit with fines on that first day. One thing that's important to note here is that 8.8 billion in lawsuits filed on the first day. Those are complaints that were filed. Most of these were all on behalf, were filed by a not-for-profit called noneofyourbusiness.eu, noyb.eu, as part of the ability for nonprofits to enforce privacy regulations in the European Union now. These were not fines. However, shortly following, we did start to see some meaningful fines, and even last week, importantly and notably, CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, imposed a $50 million fine against Google. What's interesting to note here is the basis for that fine. You look at that 50 million euros and you think, well, gee, that's not very much. But what it is going to do is going to trigger Google to look at how it had, the basis for this fine was around the lack of transparency provided by Google as to how data and personal data collected by the organization is used. And this is going to force Google, not only with the fine, they have appealed it, but I suspect that appeal process is going to eventually lead to that fine being imposed and Google having to look at and re-engineer some of its processes. But what this is going to do for the rest of the industry is, in many ways, force the Data Protection Board and the enforcement agencies into defining what constitutes good transparency. For those of you who have taken a look at something like the GDPR, you'll note that there is a good deal of discussion of, exemplars of transparency or exemplars of good security, but not a lot of follow-up as far as outlining, well, what really would work? What would make a potential enforcement agent feel comfortable that what you were doing is good. So it's very difficult to have a check or balance as far as examining what are your potential ways of addressing this. So moving on from Google, which I think was somewhat of an obvious hit and lack of transparency due to the broad size and scope and complexity of the operations of the business. That's one that we saw. Another one, though, that was last year was a fine imposed by the German privacy and one of the German data protection authorities was against Knuddels.de, Cuddles, for those of you who don't want to bother feeding the name into Google Translate. Knuddels.de was a chat site operated in Germany, social media platform that you could very easily log into and chat, primarily focused on flirting. And it was, by all rights, a rather straightforward application, straightforward usage. It actually had a privacy policy. Its privacy practices were for the most part intact. They were the subject of a hack, and they lost over 330,000 email addresses and passwords. And the response that they had was they reached out and contacted the appropriate data protection authority. They then reached out in a very timely fashion to the affected individuals and let them know, hey, we've suffered a breach. We need you to reset your password. This is the data that we lost. This is when it happened. All in compliance with the GDPR regulations. However, they still got fined. The basis for, despite the German Data Protection Authority stating that they were an exemplary example of cooperation and that an acknowledgement that as far as notification of the breach and that the transparency about their data usage were not the issue. The basis for that fine, they hadn't encrypted the passwords at rest. So they had the usernames, passwords, email addresses stored in an unencrypted format. Yes, they were a victim. Yes, they were hacked. However, the view was on the part of the Data Protection Board that the failure to encrypt was not rational. And we'll see later on in our discussion of the Article 32 of the GDPR that that failure to provide reasonable data security was the basis of the damages claim against them and the basis for the fine. So a couple of weeks ago, I was part of a panel discussion discussing my predictions for 2019. And while you have a much larger fine in the Google fine from CNIL dealing with this overarching transparency, I think what you're going to see is also this Kanoodles, DE, tiny fine, small website most people have never heard of, that this will actually be predictive of a significant area of enforcement, and that it's going to be, we are going to see not just under the GDPR, but under state laws in California and Vermont and throughout the United States, as well as other nations, we're going to see greater and greater enforcement because of the failure to have adequate data security. I think that the time of I am a victim, I got hacked, woe is me, being a defense is over, and that we are going to see not just in countries that have strong legal systems with maybe over litigious plaintiffs bars such as the United States, but in countries such as Germany, where you don't have the same abundance of personal litigation, but you are going to see regulatory authorities come down on companies for failing to implement reasonable data security. So I'm not going to go through all of my slides and presentation materials around GDPR. These slides will be available later for download, so you can have them as an outline. And as I said, I'm really just using the General Data Protection Regulation as an exemplar. This is very often the case that you can take a look, if you understand how one of these regulations work, then you can then use that to read others. So briefly taking a looking at it, territorial scope. This is going to be the idea of where does this law actually apply? Who does this apply to? And it is, in this instance, it's businesses which exist in the European Union, in one of its member states, or those which offer goods or services into the EU or engage in monitoring of citizens, individuals residing within the European Union. Very often you'll see in the GDPR, it breaks down the individuals that are subject to laws, the data subjects. Those are the natural persons that we've been discussing, those who have personal data rights. The data controllers being the companies that have directed the collection and processing of the personal data. And then data processors. Those are the companies that, hey, we're like, for example, Cylance. When a company hires us to process data in order to protect their endpoints, we are a data processor. Our customer is the data controller, and their employees are the data subjects. All of us are then subject to the supervisory authorities, which will oversee data protection in a particular jurisdiction. As I said, in that recent Google case, the CNIL was the data protection authority that lodged that fine against Google. It's interesting to note that part of the general data protection regulation is this idea of a primary supervisory authority. Google, like many companies from the United States, actually typically elects or have, due to a strong presence in Ireland and its election to have the Irish Data Protection Authority be the primary one. This is interesting to note that CNIL still chose to be the Data Protection Authority to lodge the fine against Google. Throughout all of this presentation and all discussions, I'd say, of privacy, you'll often hear references to personal data. Sometimes you'll hear it conflated with personally identifiable data, or you'll hear specifically, personal health information referred to, which is borrowed from the American Health HIPAA Act, which is Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, 2A is 1P. Personal data is anything that is identified as associated with an individual or is identifiable. It doesn't only have to be identified to an individual, it's if it could be identified at some point. So some quick examples: name, email address, physical address, online contacts, mobile device IDs, something like your job title, such as the Chief Privacy Officer at Cylance. That doesn't say my name, but it's identifiable with Greg Silberman. So recognizing that the types of data that could become subject to regulation, subject to enforcement actions, I think is important. Very often we'll hear this concept of sensitive data, and this is usually the type of things that people are more automatically able to grasp and understand would be data of specific concern. Under GDPR, it's racial, ethnic origin, religious beliefs, sex life, genetic data, biometric data, things which we should all understand inherently as being more sensitive because they reveal information that most individuals tend to want to control more directly, as opposed to, say, personal data, which, whether it's under the GDPR or even under the new California Consumer Privacy Act, could include things such as the IP address from which you are connecting to the internet, or business contact information, which most of us, slap on our business cards or freely hand out and provide, as part of our daily business and going about our daily work. Often you're going to have a concept of lawfulness of processing. That's Article 6 under the GDPR, but it's the idea that you have to have a proper purpose for collecting the data, and that data collection is going to be done, and the usage of the data is going to be done in accordance with a specific process, a specific need that you've identified to the data subject, or that the data subject should understood to be identified to them. Performance of a contract. If you want me to deliver mail to your house, I need to know where you live. Very often, there's a concept of legitimate interest, and that as long as that legitimate interest doesn't outweigh the individual's right, then it is a lawful collection. You'll notice on this, I did not spell out consent. It's listed as, these are listed in alternative. That's because consent isn't absolutely necessary for every single data collection. It is for many and required for some, but consent is itself a specific instance and specific example of that basis for making a collection and use of data lawful. Depending upon the area in which you're dealing, there may be an age of consent. There may be specific requirements as to how you obtain and save and store consent. However, it's important to remember that if consent is given, that consent can be freely withdrawn. So if you're basing the usage of data upon an individual's consent, recognize that you're going to also have the ability to get rid of that data if they withdraw that consent. There are many, these are examples of some of the specific data rights that may be given to individuals. Very often they get over conflated, such as the right to erasure. The right to erasure is as long as after the basis for the consent has gone away. So if there's no longer a good reason for you to have the data, to use the data, or you've used it for some other purpose, then that right to erasure may be invoked. Access and rectification, transparency, these are all basic rights that you will find repeated throughout numerous regulatory frameworks, not just the GDPR. And so understanding the idea of there's being a set of rights of the person whose data is being collected, I think is important to keep in mind as you provide service, as you develop products, and in recognition of it's not something that can be solely addressed by the compliance officers and lawyers. You have to recognize that, hey, I have access to this data. I can only use it for the purpose of doing the service which I've been hired to do. You can't then turn around and use it for some other purpose unless it's been agreed to or is otherwise required by law. There are specific obligations put upon the controllers and processors. Everything from Article 32, which I'll discuss next, is this concept of having to provide security of processing. As we discussed earlier, it's the basis for the Kanoodles fine in Germany, and I think we'll see it grow and grow as a result of the failure of companies to provide adequate processing. Why don't we skip right to that now anyway, just because I think for many this is the area in which you'll have the highest degree of interactivity, and it'll be where you see most of your information. The important thing to realize is that security processing, you'll notice this is not a word for word from the GDPR. Some regulations will have specific requirements. It will say, thou shalt encrypt data at rest. Thou shalt use at least X number of bits of encryption. Thou shalt use this specific types or one of several specific types of encryption. Whereas the GDPR and California and numerous other privacy regulations lean back on this idea that the security of the data that is being processed needs to take into account not just the state of the art of security available to everyone and the costs of doing so, but what is the risk? What is at risk for the individuals? That's how I believe the German DPA got to the conclusion that, hey, you really couldn't encrypt passwords. Leaving them in plain text was the best you could do. And I think a lot of what we're going to see is more and more review and analysis of various security postures and the identification that if something's been a known vulnerability for decades or a known weakness or potential vulnerability for decades, and you didn't remediate it, that this is going to be a basis to point that you didn't, and there is some damage or potential damage or risk to individuals. I think we're going to see that this is going to be an area where enforcement agencies are going to say, I'm sorry you were a victim, but you could have done more to prevent it. You could have done more to safeguard the individuals. The important thing is that controllers and processors shall implement appropriate technical organizational measures. It doesn't specify exactly what. It should also make clear that unless someone imagines that the lawyers and compliance officers and companies can affect any change at any time that they want, this also has to highlight the fact that implementing security and privacy compliance within an organization is the job of everyone in that organization. It is not something that can just be tacked on at the end. It's something that has to become part of the company, part of the entity itself. And it begins with evaluating what risk there is to the data subjects, to the individuals who you're collecting and processing data about. One thing it mentions is this idea of a code of conduct and certification methods to demonstrate compliance. That's going to be awesome as soon as we actually have such codes of conduct and certification mechanisms recognized by the Data Protection Board in the European Union as adequate and satisfactory. Finally, the idea that always there must be controls to ensure that employees only process personal data, in accordance with the instructions from the data controller. Data controller is subject to instructions from the data subjects. This being tied to the idea that you had a lawful purpose for doing something, you were transparent about what you were going to do, and now you are following up on what the agreement was between the parties. And if you don't ensure that your employees are limited to following those instructions, you've now failed in your duty to the data subjects. Data breach. God, we have all in the United States for years, decades at this point, if you're in California, received notice of, we suffered a data breach, whether you are a Starwood preferred guest member or a former government employee whose data was lost in the OPM breach. We receive numerous letters a year, some of us more, some of us fewer, notifying us of data breach. It's amusing to note that the GDPR, which is often held out as this high watermark, this is actually something we invented in America, that the California Data Breach Notification Act was the first. And just last year, the last couple straggler states implemented their own. So now there is a separate Data Breach Notification Act in all 50 states. There's another one that's associated with the Federal Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act, and now a data breach notification requirement under the GDPR. So you can imagine now that if a company suffers a data breach, it then gets to untie all of these requirements, because some of them contradict others. Some require that notice be given very promptly, specifically the requirement that data controllers notify supervisory authorities within 72 hours of discovering a breach. The complexity of dealing with a breach really should heighten the knowledge, heighten the sort of vigilance of individual companies to try and do all that they can to avoid those breaches, because untangling it after the fact is no end of pain. So another area that we often talk about is and requires our awareness as the world becomes more and more globalized and we are transferring data, is it okay to send that data over the border? Very often there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding around this. Again, I'm still just talking about GDPR here as by way of example. However, many countries embrace the concept of data sovereignty, and that their data protection laws apply to data collected from its citizens or from individuals residing within that country at that time and place. In the GDPR example, countries, data transfer is prohibited unless countries have an adequate level of protection. If there is not a judgment that those countries have an adequate level of protection, you will have to find some mechanism by which to transfer the data. In the United States, we typically rely upon the Privacy Shield framework negotiated as between the US and the European Union and the US and Switzerland. The concept of intercompany data transfers can be addressed at times by binding corporate rules, or the adoption data transfers can be addressed through the adoption of standard contractual clauses. We are also looking forward to the date when there are approved codes of conduct and certification mechanisms that can be relied upon, but to date, those don't exist. And at the end, I've noted this data processing addendums and agreements. Those are quite often the mechanism which will be spell out the basis for the transfer that's going to take place. There's always going to be some mechanism by which the regulations get enforced. Under the GDPR, we actually see potential very significant fines. The 50 million euro fine against Google is one of the first that actually seems to be embracing the capacity of the EU to seek significant fines and damages, up to the greater of 20 million euro, or 4% of total annual worldwide turnover. Clearly, the CNIL struck a middle ground, as 50 million euro is significantly less than the annual worldwide turnover of Google. However, I think the idea was to let's put a stick in the ground, start this, and not claim a number that is so outrageous that that would become the primary focus. We already see anti-competition law fines into the hundreds of millions, so there's no reason to think at some point we will not see GDPR violations into that area as well. Another thing, though, beyond fines is the idea of judicial remedies. The concept is codified under Article 29 of the GDPR, in that individuals, means data subjects themselves, can receive compensation for material and non-material harm. How this is undertaken is going to vary by member state. It may be easier to do in one, and there may be laws in place that provide it in some, but not others. And then the concept of not-for-profit organizations representing individuals. The concept of class action does not exist in the European Union as generally as it does in the United States. However, this idea of a not-for-profit organization taking up the fight on the behalf of a large collective group of data subjects gets you most of the way there. As we saw, the first complaints that got filed in the EU were filed by a not-for-profit organization, noyb.eu. So with all of that, let's take a look at sort of some common myths and legends that we see about GDPR. And in many of these cases, you could substitute any other country's privacy regulation. Not always, but many of these are generic. Very often you'll hear security equals privacy. If you have security, you're compliant with privacy. While security is an absolute necessity to having privacy, it is not the sole requirement. The idea that privacy compliance always requires explicit consent, or that consent, would have to be renewed. We all remember last year, prior to GDPR taking effect, that we were being bombarded by virtually every single website you ever visited, telling you about GDPR and then saying, hey, we need your consent. Another favorite is that our data is encrypted, so we're good. While data encryption is an example of a specific type of security procedure that can be used, it in and of itself is not adequate. The idea that GDPR requires personal data to be processed in the European Union. GDPR requires data that's transferred out to be going to a country that has adequate protection or has adopted an appropriate transfer mechanism. Very often there may be a desire to have data remain in the European Union so that it is subject to the jurisdiction more easily. And there may be reasons not to transfer it out of country that have nothing to do with the privacy requirements. However, the GDPR itself does not have a data locality requirement per se, as maybe, say, a Russian data security regulation that requires all copies of data to remain, a copy of all data to remain in country. GDPR does not actually supersede the law of any of the member states. And while there is this right to be of erasure, it is not an automatic guaranteed deletion upon request. It is, if the purpose of the data being stored and processed is no longer there, then it is appropriate to make such a request and that it may be deleted. Then I've often had people tell me that, oh, it prohibits the use of AI and ML. Again, gross oversimplification. It requires the notification of an individual if AI or ML or any other automated process will be used to make a decision about them that will take away some of their rights. We can go on. All of these are exemplars of the types of things that a partial reading gets to people, or that reliance upon quick summaries. I think it's important for us all to remember that GDPR is just one example. You are going to see this come up throughout the coming years as more and more national and state and local regulations take place with regards to privacy. And that the fact is, as security professionals, every one of you is also a privacy professional. Part of your job is securing data, securing environments. And what that also means is you are protecting that data, which in my mind is protecting privacy. And I'll just leave you with that if all of you feel like you've got a perfect grip on GDPR and ready to go, well, only 337 more days until the California Consumer Privacy Act comes online and we get to start this all again. Anyway, thank you very much. I think we'll now open it up to any questions or concerns or other issues that folks may have.
Thank you, Greg. It's very insightful. I do have a handful of questions to ask you from our audience.
Sure.
The first one is, what impact do you think personally the singularity will have on personal security?
Wow. Let's go deep and go fast. So I'm going to presume someone's talking about the Ray Kurzweil-esque subject of many a TED Talk, singularity. Without maybe going down to that level, I would say the tremendous integration of IT, artificial intelligence, highly distributed networking sensors in the form of IoT and EOT devices, combined with a growing knowledge of how the brain processes information, and people now adopting and wearing biometric sensors, is going to mean that there are going to be a vast increase in the amount of data that can be collected and processed, as well as what that data can be used for and how it can make individual determinations and very, very targeted determinations about an individual's and judgments about them. Some of them exceptionally detailed and some of them exceptionally accurate, but which in many ways may be dehumanizing. So I think that that's something that is definitely worth consideration. And if it's a topic you're really interested in, I would recommend Harare's new book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
Thank you, Greg. Next question is, what are the good methods for sending encrypted data through the cloud and avoiding interference?
You know what? I'm going to leave that to my brothers in the security profession, since I think it's more of that's going to depend upon sending it from where to where and what type of data and what volume of data. And are you talking about across mobile devices? Are you talking about using, how much real time do you need? So that's got a lot in it to unpack, and I don't think it's quite the right forum. I'll just say for my personal communications, if I'm using chat, I'm a big fan of Signal. Next.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. You were covering a section on fines. There was a general question that came in as to how are fine amounts determined?
Right. So, as I said, the fine amounts are typically determined by what's the size of the business and how egregious was the act to, or inaction. There are entire courses on this in law school in the United States. There are entire, treatises written about the subject of, how do you calculate an appropriate fine? Is a fine something that you're doing to recompense? Is it going to be done to try and dissuade a company from doing this in the future? How should it be related to the damage done or potential damage done? I think in this instance, the GDPR has set an upper limit that is high enough to say, hey, you can really, that'll really bring the screws to someone, so you're not going to want to violate it. I think from my Ganoodles example earlier, we saw an instance where, 20,000 euros, it's a pretty small fine. I think that was just there to, that determination was made that the company was super cooperative. What they did was really stupid by not encrypting the data at rest and having all of that material accessible, and it could have been done very easily. But the Data Protection Authority, I think, wanted to make the point that, hey, don't do this, now go clean it up, and reward them for being cooperative and trying to comply, but just doing a half-assed job of it.
Thank you, Greg. I have one more question is, what is, you had mentioned Privacy Shield. What is that, if you can expand on it, and how does it relate to the controller under GDPR?
Sure. The Privacy Shield is a framework. We all remember that, we had the EU, the EC, the European Community Privacy Directive, and in the 90s, all of a sudden companies were like, oh my God, I can't transfer data back and forth between the US and Europe. And they came up with a solution called Safe Harbor. And Safe Harbor was basically a negotiated agreement between the United States government and members of the European Community. Safe Harbor was adjudged inadequate, and it went away as a basis for legitimizing and authorizing transfer of data. Privacy Shield is what replaced it. And Privacy Shield is basically a legal framework negotiated as between the United States government and member states of the European Community, which allow for the transfer of data back and from the European Community to the United States. The United States has no requirements on data transferred out of the US to other nations. And so it is really just a legal framework that, if you abide by it and that you certify to it, it stands in the place of the absence of what the Data Protection Board in the EU sees as adequate law in the United States to safeguard the transfer of data subject information, personal data, to the US. And so how does it relate to the controller? For a data controller, it is the way in which they can now use cloud-based services or transfer data from subjects residing in the EU to subjects to a processor or to the data controller residing in the United States. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope this has been useful. Slides will be made available for download separately, and everyone have a great Monday. Take care.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for joining Data Privacy Day with Greg Silberman at Cylance. Today, as Greg mentioned, the webinar recording and the deck will be available at cylance.com/webinars. Thank you and have a great day.